Have you ever noticed how some people can be surrounded by hundreds of others, yet still feel profoundly alone? They don't isolate themselves. They don't push people away. They simply exist in a space where no one truly sees them. And suddenly you realize the cruelest truth about human connection. Now imagine if you understood why this happens. If you could see the invisible barrier that stands between you and authentic intimacy, between you and being truly known. That's where the point lies. The loneliness you feel has nothing to do with how many people surround you. It has everything to do with how deeply you've buried the parts of yourself that matter most. Carl Jung said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." And perhaps this is why you remain lonely. Not because you lack people, but because you've spent so long hiding your authentic self that even you have forgotten who you really are. You have been taught to be palatable, digestible, easy to understand. Since childhood, you've learned to edit yourself, to present only the parts that others can handle, to speak only the thoughts that won't disturb the peace. But here's a truth that perhaps no one has told you with this clarity. This constant self-editing is not connection, it is performance. And performance, no matter how masterful, will always leave you feeling empty inside. Do you know why? Because authentic connection requires authenticity. And authenticity means showing up as you are, not as others need you to be. But you've become so skilled at being what others want that you've lost touch with what you actually think, feel, and believe. You speak in safe generalities instead of risky specifics. You share surface-level experiences instead of the deep currents that move your soul. You offer polite pleasantries instead of the raw truths that keep you awake at night. Carl Jung understood this mechanism perfectly. He spoke about the persona, this mask we wear to be socially acceptable. And while the persona serves an important function in society, the problem arises when you become so identified with the mask that you forget there's a real person underneath. You start to believe that love and acceptance can only come if you remain safely hidden behind this carefully constructed image. But here's what most people don't realize. When you only share the sanitized version of yourself, others can only connect with that sanitized version. They're not rejecting you. They simply have no access to you. You've created an invisible barrier, a wall of acceptable thoughts and feelings that keeps your true self protected, but also keeps it profoundly alone. This is why you can be in a room full of people laughing at your jokes, agreeing with your opinions, enjoying your company, and still feel like a stranger to yourself, because they're connecting with your persona, not with you. And deep down, you know this. Deep down, you feel the ache of being unknown, unseen, misunderstood at the deepest level. The modern world has made this problem worse. Social media encourages us to curate perfect versions of our lives. Professional environments demand that we be perpetually positive and productive. Even our closest relationships often feel safer when we focus on shared activities rather than shared vulnerabilities. We've built a culture that rewards surface-level connection and punishes authentic expression. But Jung was clear about the cost of this arrangement. He said, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that are important to you. The things that are important to you, not the things that are socially acceptable, not the things that make others comfortable, but the thoughts, feelings, dreams, fears, and longings that actually constitute your inner world." You remain lonely because you've created a communication style that prioritizes harmony over honesty, approval over authenticity, peace over presence. Every time you swallow your true thoughts, every time you agree when you actually disagree, every time you smile when you're dying inside, you drive yourself further into isolation, not from others, but from yourself. And this self-abandonment creates a vicious cycle. The more you abandon your authentic self, the less worthy of love you feel. The less worthy of love you feel, the more you believe you need to perform to earn acceptance. The more you perform, the more alone you become. And the more alone you become, the more you conclude that something must be fundamentally wrong with you. But nothing is wrong with you. You're simply experiencing the natural consequence of a strategy that cannot work. You cannot find authentic connection through inauthentic means. You cannot be truly known while hiding who you are. You cannot feel genuinely loved while presenting a false self for others to love. This is why your loneliness persists despite your best efforts to be likable, agreeable, and socially skilled. You're trying to solve a problem of authenticity with tools of performance. And no matter how perfectly you perform, the real you remains hungry for recognition, validation, and genuine understanding. Now, we need to go deeper into the psychological mechanism that keeps you trapped in this cycle of isolation. Because your loneliness is not just a social problem, it's a spiritual crisis. It's what Jung called the unlived life. The parts of yourself that remain unexpressed, unacknowledged, unknown even to you. Think about this carefully. When was the last time you shared something truly important to you with another person? Not your achievements, not your plans, not your opinions about external events, but something from the core of who you are. A fear that keeps you awake, a dream that moves you to tears, a wound that shaped how you see the world, a truth about yourself that you've never spoken aloud. If you're struggling to remember such a moment, you're not alone. Most people have learned to communicate in ways that create the illusion of intimacy while maintaining perfect emotional safety. We talk about everything except what matters most. We share constantly, but reveal nothing. We're more connected than ever and more isolated than ever before. Carl Jung called this the shadow, the parts of ourselves we've pushed into unconsciousness because they seem unacceptable, dangerous, or shameful. But here's what Jung understood that most people miss. The shadow doesn't contain only negative aspects. It also holds your authenticity, your passion, your raw truth, your untamed self. When you reject these parts to maintain social acceptance, you don't eliminate them, you exile them. And what is exiled will always long to return home. Your loneliness is the cry of these exiled parts. It's your authentic self calling out from the darkness, trying to get your attention, begging to be acknowledged and expressed. But instead of listening to this call, you've learned to interpret it as evidence that something is wrong with you. You think you're lonely because you're defective, unlovable, or fundamentally flawed. But the truth is far more hopeful. You're lonely because you're whole, and wholeness includes parts of yourself that you've been taught to hide. The persona that you present to the world is like a house with only the front rooms decorated. Visitors can come and admire what you've chosen to display, but they never see the real living that happens in the back rooms. The mess, the beauty, the chaos, the authentic life that exists beyond public consumption. And you've become so identified with the front rooms that you've forgotten how rich and complex the whole house really is. This is why you can have deep conversations that somehow leave you feeling more alone than before. Because you're talking about ideas, events, other people, anything except the lived experience of being you. You're connecting mind to mind while remaining heart to heart strangers. And your heart knows the difference. Your heart recognizes that it's still waiting to be met, seen, and understood. Jung understood that this kind of existential loneliness is actually a sign of psychological health. It means your authentic self is still alive, still calling for expression, still refusing to be completely buried under social expectations. The problem is not that you feel lonely. The problem is that you've interpreted this loneliness as a signal to hide more deeply rather than as an invitation to reveal more courageously. But here's what happens when you begin to share what actually matters to you. At first, people might not know how to respond. We live in a culture that's comfortable with small talk, but terrified of big talk. When you start speaking from your depths, you'll encounter blank stares, awkward silences, and people who quickly change the subject back to safer ground. And this will feel like rejection, but it's not rejection of you. It's discomfort with depth itself. The people who can't handle your authenticity were never going to cure your loneliness anyway. They were only going to perpetuate it by rewarding you for staying hidden. True connection, the kind that actually heals loneliness, can only happen between people who are willing to risk being seen as they actually are. Carl Jung said, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. But for this transformation to occur, there must be real personalities meeting, not carefully constructed personas. There must be authentic substances coming into contact, not sanitized versions of the truth. Your loneliness is not a character flaw. It's a compass pointing toward what you need. It's your psyche's way of telling you that superficial connection is not enough, that you need something deeper, something real, something that acknowledges the full complexity of who you are. But this deeper connection cannot happen by accident. It requires conscious choice. It requires courage. It requires the willingness to be misunderstood in service of the possibility of being truly known. And here's the part that scares most people. When you start communicating what's actually important to you, you will lose some connections. People who are comfortable with your persona may not be ready for your authenticity. Relationships that were built on shared performance rather than shared truth may not survive your emergence into wholeness. But what you lose in quantity, you will gain exponentially in quality. The few people who can meet you at the level of authentic expression will offer you something that 1,000 superficial connections cannot. The experience of being known, and being known, truly known, is the antidote to loneliness. Not being surrounded by people, not being constantly entertained or distracted, but being seen and accepted in your wholeness, shadow and light together. This is what Jung meant when he talked about individuation, the process of becoming who you actually are rather than who you think you should be. And individuation is inherently relational. You cannot become yourself in isolation. You need at least one other human being who can witness and validate your authentic expression, but you also cannot wait for others to give you permission to be real. You must choose authenticity first and trust that authentic connection will follow. Now comes the practical question. How do you move from performed connection to authentic intimacy? How do you break through the invisible barrier that keeps you feeling alone, even when you're not alone? The path is not complicated, but it requires emotional courage and psychological discipline. First, you must begin to recognize the difference between what you actually think and feel versus what you think you should think and feel. This sounds simple, but for most people, the two have become so entangled that distinguishing them requires conscious effort. Start paying attention to the moments when you automatically edit yourself. When someone asks how you're doing, notice if your first impulse is to say, fine, even when you're not fine. When someone shares an opinion, observe whether you immediately look for areas of agreement even when you actually disagree. When someone asks what you want, see if you instinctively defer to what would be most convenient for them. These automatic editing mechanisms are so ingrained that they feel natural, even protective, but they're prison bars disguised as social skills. Every time you edit your truth to maintain harmony, you reinforce the belief that your authentic self is not acceptable. And what you don't accept in yourself, you cannot expect others to accept either. Carl Jung said, "Your vision becomes clear when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakens." The awakening he's referring to is the recognition that your authentic self, however imperfect, however complex, however difficult to categorize, is worthy of expression and connection. But this recognition must come from you first. You cannot wait for external validation of your worth before you begin expressing your truth. The second step is learning to communicate from your interior experience rather than from concepts and ideas. Most conversation happens at the level of thinking, opinions, judgments, analyses of external events. But loneliness is healed at the level of feeling, sharing your lived experience of being human, complete with confusion, contradiction, and vulnerability. Instead of saying, "I think the weather is nice," try saying, "The sunshine this morning made me feel hopeful for the first time in weeks." Instead of, "I disagree with that policy," try, "When I think about that issue, I feel scared about what kind of world we're creating." Instead of, "How was your day?" try, "What moved you today?" or "What challenged you today?" or "What made you feel alive today?" This shift from external to internal, from thinking to feeling, from general to specific, will feel awkward at first. You might worry that you're being too intense, too personal, too much. But remember, your loneliness exists because you've been too little for too long. The cure for hiding is not more hiding, it's conscious revelation. The third step is learning to tolerate the discomfort of being misunderstood. When you begin expressing your authentic thoughts and feelings, not everyone will understand. Some people will try to fix you, advise you, or minimize your experience. Others will become uncomfortable and change the subject. And your old conditioning will interpret this as evidence that you should return to safer, more superficial communication. But Jung understood that being misunderstood is not a failure. It's an inevitable part of authentic expression. He said, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to a better understanding of ourselves. When people react negatively to your authenticity, they're often revealing their own fear of depth, their own discomfort with genuine emotion, their own disconnection from their authentic self. Their reaction is information about them, not a judgment about you. This is where the transformation becomes challenging. You must learn to stay present with your truth even when others cannot meet you there. You must resist the temptation to retreat back into performance when authenticity feels risky. You must trust that the discomfort of being misunderstood is temporary, but the loneliness of hiding is permanent. The fourth step is recognizing and gravitating toward people who can handle your depth. Not everyone is ready for authentic connection, and that's not a character flaw. It's simply where they are in their own journey. But some people are hungry for the same kind of genuine intimacy that you're seeking. These are the people who ask follow-up questions when you share something personal. These are the people who respond with their own vulnerability when you offer yours. These are the people who can sit with your pain without trying to fix it, celebrate your joy without diminishing it, and accept your complexity without trying to simplify you. Jung called these people kindred spirits, not because they're identical to you, but because they're committed to the same project of authentic living. When you find these people, nurture these connections. Invest your emotional energy in relationships that can reciprocate depth rather than spreading yourself thin, trying to create intimacy with people who are not ready for it. The fifth step is learning to be alone without being lonely. This might seem counterintuitive. If loneliness is the problem, how can solitude be part of the solution? But Jung understood that there's a profound difference between the loneliness of disconnection and the solitude of self-companionship. When you learn to be present with yourself, to listen to your own thoughts and feelings without judgment, to enjoy your own company without constant distraction, you stop approaching relationships from a position of desperate need. Desperate need repels authentic connection because it creates pressure rather than invitation. When you need others to cure your loneliness, you're asking them to fill a void that can only be filled from within. But when you've learned to be genuinely comfortable with yourself, you can approach relationships from a position of wholeness rather than neediness. You can offer your authentic self as a gift rather than presenting your persona as a bargaining chip. This doesn't mean becoming self-sufficient to the point of not needing others. Humans are inherently relational beings, and healthy solitude should enhance your capacity for connection, not replace it. But there's a world of difference between choosing to connect because you enjoy intimacy and feeling compelled to connect because you can't stand being alone with yourself. The final step is understanding that loneliness might never completely disappear, and that's okay. Jung recognized that a certain existential loneliness is part of the human condition. We are separate beings trying to bridge the gap between distinct inner worlds. Perfect understanding is impossible, and the longing for deeper connection is actually a sign of psychological and spiritual health. But there's a profound difference between the loneliness of hiding and the loneliness of seeking. When you're hiding your authentic self, loneliness feels hopeless, endless, like evidence of your fundamental unworthiness. But when you're genuinely seeking authentic connection, loneliness becomes purposeful. It becomes a compass pointing toward what you need, a motivation for continued growth, a reminder that you're built for something deeper than surface-level interaction. The goal is not to eliminate loneliness, but to transform it from a prison into a doorway. From a sign that something is wrong with you into recognition that something is right with you, that you're wired for authentic connection and refuse to settle for substitutes. When you stop hiding behind the mask of social acceptability, something profound begins to happen. First comes the discomfort. The people who were comfortable with your persona may not know what to do with your authenticity. Some relationships may become strained or even end. You may feel more alone than ever before. But gradually, this apparent isolation transforms. It becomes a fertile solitude where your authentic self can finally take root and grow. And then comes something unexpected. Genuine connection begins to find you, not the shallow camaraderie of shared opinions or mutual entertainment, but the deep intimacy of shared humanity. People who are also tired of performing begin to recognize something real in you. Conversations become explorations rather than performances. Relationships become laboratories for authenticity rather than theaters for social acceptability. You discover that the loneliness you've been trying to cure was actually a symptom of health, your authentic self refusing to be satisfied with counterfeit connection. And when you honor that refusal by offering your real self to the world begins to offer you something real in return. Carl Jung said that the process of individuation, becoming who you truly are, requires a period of withdrawal from collective expectations. And that is exactly what you've been doing by choosing authenticity over acceptability. You're not fleeing connection. You're returning to the only foundation upon which genuine connection can be built: truth. The people who cannot handle your authenticity reveal that they never wanted you anyway. They wanted your performance. And recognizing this is liberating rather than devastating, because it frees you to invest your energy in relationships that can actually nourish your soul rather than drain it. You'll still experience loneliness sometimes, but it will be different. Not the desperate isolation of hiding, but the purposeful solitude of someone who refuses to settle for less than they deserve. Not the emptiness of disconnection, but the fullness of waiting for what's real. And when real connection comes, when someone meets you at the level of authentic expression, when they see your complexity and embrace it, when they respond to your vulnerability with their own, you'll understand why all the superficial connections left you feeling empty. You were made for this depth. You were built for this intimacy. You were designed for this kind of being known. Now tell me in the comments, are you ready to risk being misunderstood in order to be truly known? Are you willing to lose shallow connections to find deep ones? If this message resonates with the longing in your heart, write "I choose authentic connection" in the comments. Let's see how many here are ready to stop performing and start living. And if you want to go deeper into this transformational work, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell, because we're just getting started. And don't forget, keep watching the next video where we'll explore why vulnerability is not weakness, but the birthplace of courage. See you there.